Montana Territory, July 1878. The sun blistered overhead, merciless and still. Heat waves shimmered off the rocks, and the bitter range stood silent under the weight of midsummer. The creek that wound through the valley had been reduced to a narrow trickle, more memory than stream. Its voice hushed to a murmur, like it had forgotten how to roar. Orin Fletcher didn't notice the heat. Not anymore. He hadn't smiled in over a year, hadn't felt the kind of quiet that reached beyond the body and into the bones. He led his bay mare along the stony trail, dust rising in little clouds around his boots, each step a rhythm he followed without thinking. He didn't plan to stop until the next ridge, but what he saw made him freeze mid-stride. There, sprawled awkwardly beside the creek, half in the water, lay a woman. Her skirt fanned out into the mud soaked through. One arm draped limp over a stone, and her wide-brimmed straw hat had been carried a few feet downstream, caught in a lazy pool where dragonflies skimmed the surface. She wasn't moving. From where he stood, Orin could see the unnatural pallor of her skin, the slackness of her limbs. His heart kicked hard in his chest. He dropped the reins and moved fast. "Ma'am," he called, kneeling beside her. No response. Up close, her skin burned hot beneath his calloused fingers. Her lips were cracked, cheeks sunken. He tilted her head gently, eyes scanning the horizon. No wagon, no horse, no soul in sight. She was alone. He cupped her face, brushed a few damp strands of hair away. "Can you hear me?" he said, voice low. Her eyelids fluttered, lips parted, but no words came. That was all he needed. Orin slid one arm beneath her knees and another behind her back, lifting her carefully from the rocks. She was light frighteningly, so her weight more exhaustion than mass. The water clung to her skirts, soaking into his shirt, as he carried her up the bank to a patch of shade beneath a cottonwood. He laid her down gently. From his saddlebag, he fetched a tin canteen and pressed it to her mouth. "Easy," he murmured, supporting her head as he tilted the water forward. She coughed, choked once, then managed a sip. Green eyes blinked open sharp, startling against the grime on her face. Where am I?" she rasped. "You fainted," Orin said. "Found you by the creek." "Can you sit up?" She winced, then nodded faintly. "How long was I out?" "No idea," he said honestly. "I just got here. Name's Orin Fletcher." He offered her the canteen again. "You got a name?" She touched her forehead, then looked down at her ruined dress. "Gwen," she whispered. "Gwen Hollis." "What happened, Gwen?" Her voice shrank to almost nothing. "I was walking, 2 days now. Started out with a wagon group from Deer Lodge. My horse went lame. Thought I could catch up on foot." He frowned. "You walked 2 days alone out here?" She nodded slowly. "Had no choice. I was headed to a ranch near Stevensville. Supposed to start work there, cooking." He didn't respond right away, just studied her face, the heat blisters, the fatigue carved into her features. "You got family?" She looked away. Not anymore. Orin didn't press. Some wounds didn't bleed on the surface. "You need rest," he said, standing. "I've got a bedroll and enough food for 2. "I ain't leaving you here." She blinked up at him, confusion laced with something softer. "Why help me?" Orin paused, saddlebag in hand. That was the question, wasn't it? He hadn't planned on stopping, hadn't planned on caring. He was riding south, trying to outrun ghosts that didn't care much for maps. But then he saw her collapsed alone, fading under the high Montana sun, and something in him shifted, quiet but undeniable. "Because you need it," he said at last, "and because I haven't had a reason to stop in a long time. You gave me one." She didn't smile exactly, but her lips curled slightly, like her body remembered what that felt like, even if her heart didn't yet. That night, while the sky blushed into darkness, Orin built a fire beneath the stars. Gwen lay wrapped in his spare blanket, her breathing steady at last. He sat nearby, sipping black coffee that had long gone bitter, and watched the flames flicker in the reflection of her eyes. Something had begun that day beside the quiet creek. Neither of them could name it yet, but it would change everything. The night air carried the scent of dry pine and smoke curling up from the small fire Orin had built beneath a stand of cottonwoods. Gwen lay just beyond the flickering light, wrapped in his blanket, her eyes half closed, but watching him quietly as he stirred the last of the coffee in its tin pot. They hadn't said much since she'd eaten some jerky, a bit of bread. Her hands had trembled when she took the food, but she'd eaten like someone who'd gone too long, without careful not to appear desperate, even as hunger guided her. "You always travel alone?" she asked at last, her voice rough from the heat in her throat but steadying. Orin nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Since last spring." She hesitated. "Wife?" He shook his head slowly. "No. Brother." Her brow furrowed, and he could see the quiet understanding in her expression. He didn't need to explain more, but he did anyway. "We ran a cattle herd together," he said. "Got caught in a storm outside Bozeman. Snow came down hard and fast. I made it out. He didn't." Silence followed, not heavy, not awkward, but full of something shared. "I'm sorry," she said finally, barely above a whisper. "So am I," he replied, then added, "What about you?" Her eyes drifted to the stars above. "I had a brother once. He joined the war and never came back. Ma died not long after. I was 16. She paused. "Since then, it's just been me." Orin watched her through the firelight. The pain wasn't fresh anymore, but it was still there, worn into the shape of her shoulders, the way her voice thinned when she talked about it. "You're tough," he said. She gave a soft snort. "No, just stubborn." That earned the first real smile Orin had managed in longer than he cared to admit. Not wide, not showy, just a slight lift at the corner of his mouth. But it was real. They slept in shifts that night. Orin kept watch while Gwen dozed. When her fever broke just before dawn, she murmured something he couldn't quite hear and rolled to her side, sleeping soundly at last. The next morning the sun rose warm and gold over the Bitterroot Hills, painting the sky in streaks of honey and smoke. Orin saddled his mare and turned to Gwen as she stood steady now, though still pale. "I can ride," she said, her voice firmer. "You sure?" She nodded. "Just don't ask me to walk another mile." He helped her up behind the saddle, her arms slipping gently around his waist. Her head rested between his shoulder blades, light as breath, and something inside him stirred, something that had been still for far too long. They rode slow, following the ridge trail westward. The world around them was vast, and the trail seemed endless, but it didn't feel empty. Not anymore. By midday the clouds had gathered thick and fast, and thunder cracked like a warning across the sky. Orin found shelter in a grove of fir trees and pulled a canvas tarp over them just as the rain came in sheets. Gwen laughed when the wind nearly tore the covering from his grip, a sound that startled even her. "I forgot what that felt like," she said, brushing wet strands from her face. He looked at her, damp and flushed, and something softened in his chest. "You don't even know me," she said, quieter now. "I'm getting to," he replied, offering her the last of the smoked meat. "You talk in your sleep, you know." She flushed but smiled anyway. That night they sat close by the fire again, steam rising from their drying clothes. Gwen leaned her head lightly on his shoulder, and this time he didn't flinch. He just sat still, letting her stay, letting the closeness sink in. "You have kind eyes," she said suddenly. Orin blinked, caught off guard. "That's a first." "No," she said. "It's the first thing I noticed." By the third day, her color had returned. She sat straighter in the saddle, her voice steadier, her eyes more alert. When the trail forked beneath the rise of a rocky bluff, Orin pulled the horse to a stop. "Stevensville's that way," he said, pointing left. "Still want to find that ranch?" Gwen didn't answer immediately. Her fingers tightened slightly around his coat. "What about you?" she asked. He shrugged. Hadn't decided. Was thinking of heading south. She was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Would you come with me?" Orin turned, surprised by her voice, by the clarity in her eyes. "If you want me to," he said. "I do," she answered. They rode on together, and the land opened up before them, pine giving way to pasture, stone to soil. And Orin Fletcher, a man who had forgotten what it meant to hope, found himself smiling again. Not because life had grown easier, but because Gwen Hollis had asked him to stay. And for the first time in a long time he wanted to. The ranch sat quiet beneath a pale morning sky, dew still clinging to the tall grass, the scent of earth rising with the mist. Gwen stood at the edge of the east hayfield skirts, gathered in one hand, watching Orin dig into the hard-packed soil. He moved with deliberate ease, every motion purposeful, like he'd been doing this kind of work his whole life. "You ever teach someone to fence?" before she asked, stepping closer, breath visible in the cool morning air. Orin looked up, the sun catching in the creases of his face. "Nope," he said, "but I reckon I can teach you how not to dig the hole sideways." She smirked, took the spade from him. "That's a start." He guided her through the rhythm, how to brace her feet, where to set the post, when to lean into the weight of the earth. The work was hard, the dirt was dry and stubborn, and her hands blistered before noon. Still, Gwen didn't stop. She worked through the pain, jaw tight, shoulders set. Orin noticed, but he didn't offer pity, just handed her a strip of jerky and a cold tin cup of water during the break. "Why'd you leave your brother's herd?" she asked quietly, sitting in the shade of a half-fixed fence rail. Orin leaned back on his elbows, staring out toward the line of hills. "Because without him it wasn't mine anymore." Gwen nodded. She didn't ask more. She understood that kind of silence, the way grief could shift the shape of your world until it no longer fit. She looked out across the valley, then down at her dust-streaked skirts. "I used to dream of running a boarding house, maybe a bakery in a big town, something with noise and light." And now, Orin asked. She was quiet for a beat. "Now I think I just wanted somewhere that didn't move, a place that stays." He turned his head toward her. "You think this could be that place?" She looked at him, full and steady. "I think it already is." Later they worked side by side, repairing the last corner of the fence. When Gwen's hand slipped and the post wobbled, Orin caught it before it fell. "You're getting the hang of it," he said. She looked up, a strand of hair falling loose from her braid. "You always this encouraging?" He gave a dry smile. "Nope, just honest." The days passed in rhythm, fence posts, chores, shared meals. In the evenings, Gwen helped Maven peel apples in the kitchen while Orin oiled tack under the fading light. They didn't need constant conversation. Silence had a different weight now, comfortable, known. Like a room both of them were willing to stay in. One evening, as the last of the sunlight draped the barn in gold, Gwen walked across the yard, her apron still dusted with flour. "I could stay on through harvest," she said, setting down a pail by the barn door. "Longer, maybe." Orin looked up from the saddle, he was tending the leather warm beneath his hands. "You want that? I think I do," she said, eyes lifting to meet his. "This place feels right. Solid." He set the saddle aside, brushing his palms on his trousers. "I've been thinking the same." She sat beside him on the barn threshold, her shoulder barely brushing his. The sky stretched wide above them, streaked with soft pink and smoky lavender. "I never expected to feel safe again," Gwen said. "Not really." "You are now," he told her, voice low and firm. She reached over her fingers, brushing his, tentative at first, then certain. He didn't pull away. Their hands fit, like they were always meant to. They sat there until the stars blinked into view one by one, and in the quiet that followed, neither of them said what they were both thinking. That whatever this was, whatever had started with dust and desperation beside a dying creek, was growing into something they might be able to keep. Something real, something worth staying for. The Montana wind cut low through the dry grass as Gwen tugged her sleeves up and knelt beside the half-dug post hole. Her palms were raw, the muscle in her arms aching from days of labor, but she welcomed the pain. It made the moment real, tangible proof she was building something that might last. Orin stood nearby, arms crossed, eyeing the lean of the new fence post. "You call that straight?" She squinted up at him. "Straighter than the last one, barely." He walked over and nudged the wood with his boot. "Still better than most green hands do their first week." Gwen wiped her forehead, sweat streaking the dirt there. "Are you saying I'm improving?" "I'm saying I might let you build a fence without supervision next time." She smiled at that, soft, unforced. These moments were becoming common between them, like laughter had found its way back into her chest without asking permission. They dug and packed and braced the next post together in silence. It wasn't an awkward quiet, but the kind that settles between people when words have already been said elsewhere. Later they sat beneath the oak at the field's edge, passing a canteen back and forth. "I used to imagine a life with noise," Gwen said, staring toward the hills. "A bakery with bells on the door, a boarding house where I'd learn every guest's story." I thought if I could just find the right place, I'd finally feel whole. And now Orin asked. She paused, chewing the inside of her cheek. Now I think I don't need all that noise. Just want somewhere I don't have to keep leaving. A place that lets me breathe. He nodded slowly, thoughtful. That's not nothing. She looked at him then. What about you? You still plan on leaving when the season turns? Orin leaned back against the tree. I used to think I'd just keep riding until I forgot what I was running from. But this… He motioned to the fence line, the house in the distance, the shape of the valley spread out before them. This doesn't feel like something to ride away from. He caught her eyes then, and there was no teasing in them now, just quiet certainty. Later that evening, Gwen stood at the basin in Maven's kitchen, scrubbing flour from her fingers. The scent of rising bread filled the room. Through the open window, she could see Orin walking the fence line alone, his shoulders cast in amber light. You two look settled, Maven said gently from across the table, peeling apples with practiced ease. Gwen didn't look up. It's strange, she said, how fast something can feel right when it fits. Maven gave a knowing hum. Just be sure it still fits when the winter comes. Gwen nodded, her hands stilling in the water. I intend to find out. That night Gwen found Orin in the barn, brushing down one of the mares. She's been limping, he said without turning. I noticed. They stood in the quiet, the soft sound of bristles brushing hide between them. Maven's asked me to stay on through the winter, Gwen said. He paused, the brush still in his hand. Will you? I want to. He turned finally and met her eyes. And me. You planning to go? He stepped closer. No. She didn't move. Then stay. Orin reached for her hand, his fingers rough but warm around hers. You sure I've never been more? Their foreheads met in the dim light breath, mingling in the hush of the barn. Around them the quiet was thick with the sound of horses settling, of wind brushing against weathered boards, of something new blooming slow and deep. Neither of them said the word love, but it lived in the way Gwen leaned into him and the way Orin stayed still, his arms circling her like he'd found his place and had no intention of letting it slip away. And in that quiet beneath the scent of straw and saddle soap, they both knew this wasn't just comfort, it was home. The valley had turned gold. Fields stretched in neat rows, the wheat already cut and bundled. The air hung thick with the smell of ripe apples, wood smoke and drying hay. At dusk, lanterns flickered to life along the porch rails, and somewhere in the hills a fiddle began to play. Gwen stood by the kitchen window, fingers dusted with flour, watching the barnyard empty of light. Behind her, Maven rolled out crusts for apple pies, speaking of the Grange Hall and how half the valley would be there tonight. You going? Maven asked. Gwen didn't answer right away. She stared out toward the shed where Orin was splitting kindling in the falling light. His movements were steady, his silence familiar. I asked him to come, Gwen said softly. He said yes. Orin had never worn anything fancy, but tonight he made the effort. He trimmed his beard with a borrowed razor and brushed the dust off his best coat, the same one he'd worn into the valley months ago. As he waited on the porch, hands tucked in his pockets, he glanced toward the kitchen window and saw her silhouette moving behind the curtain. When she stepped out, he straightened unconsciously. Gwen wore a dark blue dress with a lace collar, her hair pinned up in a way that made her seem at once older and more radiant. The boots were borrowed, the dress a loan, but she moved in them like they were hers. You clean up well, she said with a smile. I was thinking the same. They rode into town in the ranch's buckboard, pulled by the oldest mule. Gwen sat close, her shoulder brushing his each time the cart bumped a rut in the road. Neither of them said much. The silence between them no longer asked for filling. The Grange Hall glowed like a lantern in the dark. Warm yellow light spilled through the open doors, and fiddle music floated out, lively and fast. Inside the room pulsed with energy, boots stamping, skirts spinning, voices rising with laughter. Orin hesitated at the threshold. Gwen touched his hand. You don't have to dance. He looked down at her. But I want to. Just don't let go if I get it wrong. She smiled and pulled him forward. I won't. The first tune was fast, and Orin fumbled through the steps. Gwen guided him gently, never mocking, only meeting his missteps with warmth. When the tempo slowed, he found his footing. Their hands clasped, his arm circled her waist, and the room seemed to narrow around them. until there was only the sound of the fiddle, the floor beneath their feet, and the space they shared. "They're watching," he murmured. "They always watch," she replied. "But they don't know our story." He looked down at her, at the way her eyes didn't waver. "I'm not used to this," he said. "Belonging." "I wasn't either," Gwen whispered. "Until you." The music drifted on. They danced 3 songs, then 4. By the time they stepped out into the night, Orin had nearly forgotten how unsure his feet had once been. Outside, the valley lay beneath a blanket of stars. The air was cooler now, sweet with the scent of apples and the fading hum of music behind them. Gwen crossed her arms and looked up at the sky. "My mother once told me, she said that love comes slow when it's meant to last." Orin turned toward her. "Is that what this is?" She looked at him, quiet, steady, sure. It could be, and that was when he kissed her. No hesitation, no rush. Just a gentle lean, a brushing of lips that deepened when she stepped into him. Her hand slid up to his chest, and he cradled her face with fingers still rough from work. The world spun quietly around them, lanterns flickering behind the windows, horses snorting from the nearby hitching post, wind rustling dry leaves on the trees. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again," she said. "You are now," he replied. They didn't rush back to the wagon. They stood there a while longer, her hand curled in his, as though anchoring a truth neither of them had dared to believe until now, that what they'd found wasn't fleeting. That home wasn't a place they were chasing, but something they had built together quietly, step by step, one slow dance at a time. The first frost came quiet. It crept in one morning, dusting the porch railings and orchard grass in silver. The apples had been picked, the wheat bundled and stored, and the chickens had started huddling closer to the coop at dusk. The land was shifting, tucking itself in for the long winter ahead. Gwen stood by the window, fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching Orin cross the yard with an armful of firewood. He moved with calm purpose, the kind born not of habit, but of intention. Every board he nailed, every stove he lit, said one thing: "I'm still here." That morning, Maven had asked Gwen a question over the peeling of apples. "You planning to stay past the harvest?" Gwen didn't answer right away. She thought of the way Orin's coat smelled of smoke and saddle oil, of how his eyes softened when he listened instead of spoke, of the barn lights at dusk, the hush in the kitchen just before dawn, the way silence no longer felt lonely. "Yes," she said simply, "if there's a place for me." "There's a small house behind the orchard," Maven offered, pausing in her work. It was Harlan's uncle's, empty since last winter. "Needs fixing up, but the bones are strong." Gwen blinked, surprised. "And Orin, he hasn't said it, but he'd follow you there barefoot." They moved in by the end of the week. No ceremony, no promises made before a preacher, just Orin hauling boxes and tools in the back of a wagon, and Gwen folding linens with hands that knew what home felt like now. The little house was weathered, the roof in need of patching, the stove temperamental, but the windows caught the morning light just right, and the porch faced the orchard. Orin replaced the broken shingles. Gwen scrubbed the cabinets with vinegar and hot water. Together they stitched curtains out of feed sacks and lined the pantry with jars she'd put up in August: peaches, pickles, jam. The first night in the house, Gwen lit a single oil lamp and stood brushing out her hair in the glow of it. Orin leaned against the doorway, shirt collar undone, watching her like she might vanish if he blinked too long. "I never meant to find you," she said softly. He stepped closer, slow and sure. "I never thought I'd want to stay." She reached for him, and he caught her close. No words after that, just breath, just warmth, just the quiet thrum of something steady and deeply earned. They didn't rush. The house didn't need grandeur, and neither did they. Winter settled in thick and cold, laying white over the roof and fence posts. Orin rose early, splitting wood before dawn. Gwen kept the stove warm, a kettle always simmering, bread rising on the windowsill. Their lives wove together the way 2 rivers meet, not colliding but running side by side. At night they sat by the hearth reading or listening to the wind curl under the doorframe. Sometimes she'd mend his shirts. Sometimes he'd rub the soreness from her shoulders after long hours kneading dough or hauling water. They shared the kind of silence that only people who trust each other completely can hold. One evening, as snow ticked softly against the windows, Gwen laid out a patchwork quilt over their shared bed. "Do you miss the trail?" she asked, not looking up. Orin tossed another log into the stove. "Not when I know where I'm going in the morning." She smiled faintly. "You ever think we should have done it proper? A ceremony. A ring." He walked over and took her hand, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "That house, this fire, your hand in mine, that's all the promise I need." She leaned into him, cheek against his chest. His arms wrapped around her, not with desperation but with ease. Neither of them had chased this life, but now that it was here, they clung to it not with fear, but gratitude. Because sometimes the quiet kind of love, the kind without declarations or crowds or vows, shouted into the sky, was the kind that lasted the longest. The last frost broke in early April. Patches of green pushed up through the thawed ground, and the orchard trees wore soft buds like promises yet to bloom. The wind lost its bite and instead carried the scent of wet earth, new grass, and wood smoke from the stove where Gwen baked their first loaves of the season. Orin rose early that morning, shoveling the last of the snow from the path. When Gwen stepped out with coffee in hand, he was already at the fence line, sleeves rolled, measuring rows with a length of twine. "You planning to build something?" she asked, sipping. "Just the future," he said with a half smile. "Thought we'd plant corn where the slope gets the most sun. Maybe beans along the edge." She nodded. "I'll trade Mrs. Tally for seeds. She's got more than she can use." They spent the next week working side by side. Orin dug the rows Gwen followed, with her apron pockets full of seeds. Dirt clung to her hands, to her skirt hem, but she didn't mind. At night they sat on the porch and watched the frogs return to the creek, the stars slowly filling in the sky above them like lanterns. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Gwen leaned on the porch rail and turned to him, quiet but certain. "There's something I need to tell you." Orin stilled, sensing the shift in her voice. She looked at him, not nervous, just full of something so big she could barely hold it in. "I'm carrying a child," she said softly. "Yours." The world stopped moving. Orin's eyes widened, his breath caught, and then without a word, he dropped to his knees in the dust of the porch. He pressed his face gently to her belly, arms wrapping around her waist like she might slip away if he didn't hold her close. She laughed, a shaky, teary sound threading her fingers through his hair. "I didn't know how you'd feel." He looked up, eyes wet, voice rough. "Like I was given something I didn't think I'd ever deserve." They named the boy Caleb. He was born in October, while the last leaves turned gold and the wind started to whisper of snow again. The birth came quick and hard. Gwen bore it in silence, teeth-gritted sweat slicking her brow. Orin stayed beside her the entire time, one hand clutching hers, the other steadying her as she bore down through the waves of pain. When the cries came sharp, fierce, alive, Gwen wept. Orin did too openly and without shame, his hand resting on her heart and the newborn's back as he breathed in both their warmth. Life after Caleb didn't slow, but it deepened. They learned the rhythm of 3 nights filled with soft cries and stoking the stove at odd hours. Days marked by first smiles, tiny fingers gripping Orin's thumb, and Gwen's lullabies floating through the rafters of their small house. Caleb grew strong, he had Gwen's eyes and Orin's quiet. He learned to walk beneath the same cottonwoods where Orin had once found Gwen half dead from fever and sun. And when he fell, scraped his knees, or burst into tears, it was Orin who lifted him, Gwen who kissed his brow, and both of them who reminded him, "You're safe. You're home." Years passed in gentle, purposeful motion. The corn came up thick each summer. Orin built a second room onto the house with his own hands. Gwen taught Caleb to read by lantern light while supper simmered behind them. Orin taught him how to mend fence posts and listen for the weather's voice in the wind. Some nights when the world outside howled with snow or crackled with heat, the 3 of them sat together by the hearth, no words spoken, no noise needed. Just firelight, a boy nestled between 2 hearts that beat for him, and the kind of peace that only comes after long miles of sorrow. They had not set out to find each other, but they had. And they had chosen to stay. Not because life was easy, but because together it finally made sense. Years passed like pages turned slowly by a steady hand. The small house behind the orchard stood firm through every season, its whitewashed boards weathered, but proud smoke curling from the chimney each morning like a signal to the world life lives here. Inside time unfolded not with grand events, but with quiet rituals. Gwen rose early to knead bread by the window. Orin hauled water and mended what needed mending. Caleb, wide-eyed and curious, grew into the fields and fences like they'd been stitched into his bones. Gwen taught him letters by lamplight, tracing each vowel with care until the words came easier and stories could take root in his mind. Orin taught him how to check for rot in fence posts, how to read the shift in the clouds, and how to use his hands gently even when they were strong. By the time Caleb was 6, he could split kindling, recite poems, and identify a hawk's cry from across a field. But more than any of that, he knew he was loved. That was the soil he grew in. Evenings were their favorite time. They'd gather on the porch when the sun dipped low and bled gold across the hills. Orin would rest his boots on the rail, Gwen would shell peas into a tin bowl, and Caleb would curl against her side with a book or 1,000 questions. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of shared labor, of meals made together, of harvests won and storms endured. It held the memory of that first kiss under lantern light and the cries of a newborn in a dark October night. It held every sunrise they'd watched from the same doorstep, every laugh that echoed through the orchard trees. One autumn evening, as the wind carried the crisp scent of drying leaves, Gwen leaned against Orin and whispered, "Do you ever miss the trail?" Orin tilted his head, thoughtful. "Sometimes," he said, "but only the part where I imagined finding this." She smiled and laced her fingers through his. Caleb, now 10, ran out from the barn, just then hands streaked with dirt and a grin stretching ear to ear. "I fixed the latch on the coop, Pa," he called. "Like you showed me." Orin nodded with quiet pride. "Good work." Gwen rose, brushing off her apron. "Come wash up, dinner's almost ready." As they turned back toward the house, Orin lingered a moment on the porch. He looked out across the land, the fences he'd built, the trees Gwen had planted, the little prints in the dirt where Caleb had chased chickens that morning. This wasn't the life he thought he'd have. It was better. No one in town ever asked if they were legally married. No one cared. Folks knew them as the couple who showed up to help when fences fell in storms, who offered bread when the snow piled too high for travel. They were family in every way that mattered. And on the days when grief whispered, when memory tugged Orin back to a cold night outside Bozeman, or Gwen to a wagon train she never should have left, they didn't run from it. They let it pass, then returned to the warmth of what they had built. Years folded into decades. Caleb grew taller than his father, stronger than his mother, and just as gentle as both. He left once to see the world, but he came back. He always came back, because some roots grow so deep they tug at your heart no matter how far you roam. One morning, long after the orchard had gone quiet for winter, Orin and Gwen sat on the porch, wrapped in a shared blanket, their hair silver in the soft light. "You know," Gwen said, watching the sunrise, "I never knew I was looking for you." Orin squeezed her hand, voice low and full. "And I didn't know I needed to be found." They stayed like that until the frost melted from the railing, until the birds began to sing again. And long after their voices faded from the earth, the house stood strong, the orchard bloomed, and the porch remained a place where love once lived and lingered, forever in the last light of day.